When patients check into a hospital for routine treatment, they're placing immense trust in the hands of the people who are there to help them. But in the mid-1970s, that trust was shaken, maybe even shattered, inside a small-town hospital in southern Illinois. What should have been standard procedures ended in a series of unexplained cardiac arrests, and soon, whispers of medical error gave way to darker fears because people weren't just getting sick, they were passing away, and someone, it seemed, may have been behind all of this. I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first. At the center of it all was Marion Memorial Hospital, a modest facility in the city of Marion, Illinois. In 1974 and 1975, a wave of bizarre medical emergencies unfolded there, and they were ones that absolutely did not align with the conditions patients were there to be treated for. By the end of it, at least 3 people passed away and others barely survived. All of their cases shared eerie similarities, and the deeper authorities dug, the clearer it became. Someone was turning harmless treatments into fatal ones. The first known incident took place on September 21st of 1974. 21-year-old Jimmy Dean Watson arrived at Marion Memorial with a lingering foot injury from a car crash 2 weeks earlier. This was not urgent, it was just a minor issue that needed attention, and as part of his care, Jimmy was given an injection of procaine, a commonly used anesthetic at that time. But what happened next was not common at all. Jimmy started to have immediate serious seizures, and then his heart stopped, not once but multiple times. After emergency interventions failed to stabilize him, he was transferred in critical condition to St. Luke's Hospital in St. Louis, but the damage had already been done, and poor Jimmy never recovered. He passed away on October 5th. 10 days later, something strange was discovered at the hospital, but it didn't come from the emergency room. A respiratory therapist named William Flack stumbled on 2 sealed vials of anectine, a potent muscle relaxant hidden in a locker inside the respiratory therapy department. Anectine wasn't unusual in itself, it was used to suppress muscle movement during surgeries, but its misuse could be fatal, and the vials obviously should not have been sitting where they were. And more importantly, nobody could explain why they were there. Flack turned the vials over to a man named William, the lead anesthesiologist. William, in turn, handed them off to hospital administrator Nolan England, and what England did or didn't do with those vials would become a key issue later. But at the time, there was no public alarm, at least not yet. That would all change on October 2nd. A 3-year-old boy named Brian was with his grandfather that day, and he was sitting in a parked pickup truck listening to a baseball game. And at one point, somehow, the little boy accidentally tumbled out of the truck and hit his head. But it wasn't serious, it was just a bump, and out of caution, his grandfather decided to take him to the Marion Memorial Hospital. But what followed was almost identical to what had happened to Jimmy. Little Brian was given Blockane, another anesthetic, and went into cardiac arrest shortly after. This time, there was no second hospital, and again, no miracle. Little Brian was pronounced deceased. And then a day later, on October 3rd, it happened again. Michael Simmons, a 15-year-old high schooler, had taken a knock to the eyebrow in gym class. Again, nothing major, but he was treated at Marion Memorial and administered procaine, just like Jimmy. And by now you can probably predict what's going to happen. He too went into sudden cardiac arrest, but unlike the others, he actually survived. This was enough to sound alarm bells for one of the ER doctors, H.T. Merrill. He treated both Brian and Michael, and now the similarities were impossible to ignore. He moved very fast, and he ordered all remaining vials of procaine and Blockane in the emergency department to be pulled and sent to Administrator Nolan England for immediate testing. But that's not what happened. England didn't have the vials tested right away. In fact, he waited more than 3 months. And it wasn't until January 10th, 1975 that one of the open procaine vials was finally sent to a lab in Chicago. The results came back on January 24th. The vial had been tampered with. It contained high levels of anectine, so the same drug that had turned up in the respiratory locker room back in October. A second test was conducted on a Blockane vial on January 29th, and it was laced with anectine. At this point, the hospital had confirmed that at least 2 types of anesthetic used in multiple cardiac arrest cases had been contaminated, and it should have triggered an emergency response, but instead, England quietly fired William Flack, the respiratory therapist who had originally found the hidden vials. Nobody called the police. The lab results sat unreported for another 3 weeks until hospital board chairman Kenneth Powless finally turned the evidence over to the state attorney's office on February the 18th, and that's when the Illinois Bureau of Investigation stepped in. By February 24th, state agents were combing through the hospital's drug storage protocols. What they found was disturbing. Medications like procaine, Blockane, and even anectine weren't kept under lock and key. They were stored in an open-access storage room. This means that any nurse, doctor, or staff member could walk in and grab up to 10 vials at a time, rather than just the anesthesiologist. Once taken, they were often left in unlocked drawers inside operating rooms. And the emergency department, it turned out, shared a wall with these rooms. According to pharmacist Glenn Reed, the operating area wasn't even closely monitored when it wasn't in use. Anyone with ER access could have walked in and tampered with the drugs, and because of this, investigators quickly ruled out a manufacturing issue. The only way the anectine could have ended up in the other vials was through manual interference, and the process was not at all simple. So inevitably, on September 19th of 1975, nearly a year after the first incident, the families of Jimmy and Brian were brought into the state attorney's office and informed that their loved ones hadn't just died. They had been murdered. Authorities admitted that they hadn't said anything sooner to protect the investigation, but the case was already slipping through their fingers. Despite months of investigation, only a handful of hospital employees had even been interviewed. Several others had since moved out of the state, and some of the contaminated vials had already been discarded by hospital staff, destroying potential evidence. But still, authorities tracked down former employees one by one. William Flack was questioned and passed a polygraph. So were several other respiratory therapists and anesthesiologists. No charges were filed against anyone. And in time, other patients were identified who had suffered similar medical episodes. On August 27th, 26-year-old Lonnie Barnes went into cardiac arrest after receiving anesthetic for a minor hand injury. He also survived. And the next day, 38-year-old Shirley Travelstead went into cardiac arrest following treatment for poison oak. She unfortunately passed away 3 days later. And the list just keeps going on. In January 1975, 21-year-old Alan Lindsay was shot in the leg in a hunting accident and brought to the ER. While he was sedated, he claimed he saw an unidentified person attach a vial to his IV. He went into cardiac arrest within minutes, but he fortunately was revived. And due to the sedation, he couldn't describe the person. At least 4 other possible victims were uncovered, but their details were never made public. Alma Hill was given liquid Benadryl after a minor procedure and almost immediately suffered heart failure. She was resuscitated but passed away 3 months later. The Benadryl vial used on her was saved and tested, and like the others, it contained lethal levels of anectine. In the aftermath, in 1976, Nolan England was charged with official misconduct in connection to Alma Hill's death, but a judge later acquitted him. He stayed in his role as hospital administrator until resigning in 1981. Kenneth Powless, the board chairman, stepped down in 1976, but he never faced charges. No suspect was ever named and no one was held accountable. Whatever happened inside Marion Memorial Hospital between 1974 and 1975 is still unknown. This case is just so odd to me. This is a topic that I just genuinely am surprised has not received more coverage. It's absolutely insane. There's so many details to it. So many lives were lost, whether directly or indirectly, and I don't know. I feel like I could see a whole Wendigoon video on this too, so someone should tell him about it. Rest in peace to all the people who fell victim to this, and hopefully, one day, even though it's unlikely, we can get to the bottom of this. Also, this entry was largely based on an amazing write-up by the Bones of Autumn on Reddit. I've mentioned them before, but I just have to give them a quick shout-out because they're a source for so many good obscure mysteries, and a lot of these videos actually have entries that I found through them. In a quiet coastal village in the south of France, the summertime usually just brings beachgoers, maybe some sun, and some good times. But in 2005, the disappearance of 3 siblings in this village turned the season into something far darker. And nearly 20 years later, their story remains unsolved with no evidence, no witnesses, and no explanation. It's a case that even seasoned investigators admit feels like a total failure, and when I heard about this, I just knew I had to cover it. It started on June 16, 2005, when 2 brothers, 16-year-old Jean-Baptiste Thérard and his older brother, 18-year-old Matthew, seemingly vanished from their home. Initially, there wasn't much urgency. These boys came from a fractured household, and unfortunately, hearing stuff like this wasn't all that uncommon. In fact, their mother, Cecil, had also left the home earlier that year for a period of time. Their father, Dominique Thérard, was a depressed butcher with a reputation for being volatile, aggressive, and difficult to deal with. So, when the boys disappeared and Dominique initially reported them missing, only to walk it back days later, authorities didn't push too hard. He told police that he had found out the boys had simply just gone traveling, first to Nice and then to Spain and eventually to Canada. There were no signs of violence, no one was particularly concerned, and as far as the police could tell, there were no immediate contradictions to his story. It sounded plausible enough, but little did they know, things were about to get a whole lot darker. A few weeks later, things escalated. The boy's 20-year-old sister had also vanished, and this time, friends sounded the alarm. They began to ask around and distribute missing persons flyers, hoping that someone had seen her. With all 3 siblings now missing, even though the father said that the boys had come back, the case became impossible to ignore. Still, the early investigation was slow to develop, probably due to how this family was known to be. Dominique's reassurances once again delayed the urgency, but everything shifted for worse on September 26 of 2005. That day, Dominique Thérard had passed away at his parents' home in northern France, and it was at his own hands. He left behind a disturbing piece of information. In it, he told his estranged wife, who had apparently left him shortly before this, "You must know that you will never see the children again. They have gone very far away. You had my name, you lost me, and you lost the children." And that message turned what had up to this point been treated as a vague family disappearance into something much darker. Investigators with the Marcel Research Section began to dig. They finally stopped believing Dominique's initial story about his kids' disappearances and started looking at him as a possible suspect, but again, nothing added up. They checked every location that he frequented. He was a known hunting enthusiast, and they all came up empty. There was no remains, no physical evidence, and his vehicle was also combed for clues, but nothing. Forensic testing on his knives and tools found no suspicious traces. They even looked into whether or not he'd used another vehicle, but that lead didn't go anywhere either, so at this point, it was really just hard for them to say what on earth had happened here, or what exactly had happened. More than 1,000 investigative steps were taken. There were interviews, forensic searches, sample collections, and re-examinations, and they led nowhere. And still to this day, there's no bodies, no murder weapon, and no confirmed crime scene. Just 3 missing siblings and the final words of a father that seemed very suspicious. The prosecutor in charge, Christian Gerard, later said that every single investigative avenue had been exhausted. There simply just wasn't anything left for them to pursue. Despite the chilling nature of Dominique's final letter, the investigation had never been officially classified as a homicide, only a disturbing disappearance, and without physical proof of a crime, the courts couldn't go further. Another individual who led the case admitted years later, "We don't have a single clue. There's no witnesses, no body, no crime scene, no weapon, nothing." So, just confirming what we already knew. He called the case a failure, and to this day, that's how it sits. The children's uncle, Marc Dubois, said he used to believe that they'd come back. He even told reporters that he still dreams about it. Their mother, Cecil, reportedly continued to seek help from psychics, hoping for any sign of her children, and it's a hope that realistically has little to stand on, but one that hasn't faded for her completely. And I just want to say, if you're confused about the mother at all in this story and where she stood in all of this, I'm also very confused. It seems that because she was obviously in an abusive relationship, she was always leaving him and coming back. But as far as I can tell, she had left permanently just before all the kids went missing. That's what it seems like, and the note obviously confirms that. And then from there, they all just slowly started to disappear under suspicious circumstances. Clearly, the father has something to do with this, but we probably will never know. If you're into UFOs and alien encounter stories in general, you've probably heard every single one of them. Even if you don't particularly like these things or have doubts about them, you too have probably almost heard every single one of them, and that's because there's really only so many interesting ones out there. Well, this one I'm discussing now is one that's so obscure that even the most experienced in the field have almost all never heard of it. It makes for an interesting account, it has interview footage, predictions, comes from a reputable person, and I think you'll find it fascinating. Some UFO stories start and end in a flash, a strange light in the sky, maybe a weird sound, and then nothing, but others linger. They unfold in a way that almost seems to make them feel intentional or like somebody's trying to show you something, and that's exactly what happened to a man who called himself Stefan Denaerde. This wasn't his real name, it was a pseudonym, but what we would later come to find out is that he was actually a Dutch businessman. Very wealthy, successful, and logical, and by all accounts the kind of person you'd expect to dismiss the idea of aliens altogether, not lean into it. But in 1967, something happened off the coast of the Netherlands that, according to him, could not be ignored. He was on a boat with his family just offshore near Oostvoorn. It was a calm day, there was no storms, no strange weather, everyone was enjoying themselves, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. Then, all at once, their boat stopped moving, dead in the water. There was no warning, and it didn't feel like a mechanical failure. It felt like someone had almost turned off the boat themselves. They didn't hit anything and the engine didn't even sputter, it just halted. Then, according to Stefan, a large metallic object surfaced near their boat. He mocked up drawings of what it looked like, and according to him, it was disc-shaped, smooth, and silent. It didn't rise into the air, it just floated above the water. There was no lights, no engine noise, and just an eerie stillness. He said it didn't feel threatening, but it didn't feel like anything human either, though at this point he didn't know. That alone would be strange enough, but Stefan says what happened next pushed it beyond anything he could explain. He claimed beings emerged from the aircraft. They were humanoid, but not entirely human. They were small in stature, with thin bodies and noticeably large heads. Their skin had a pale bluish-gray tint, but what caught him off guard wasn't how they looked, it was how they communicated. There were no voices, and yet Stefan said he understood them perfectly. Thoughts entered his mind as if they'd always been there. This was a case of telepathy. Then they invited him to come with them. He almost instinctively agreed, and his family was absolutely terrified. And if you're like me, you may immediately be thinking this is BS, but there's some interesting points here, so just stick around. What he describes remembering next is very detailed. Inside the craft, he said everything was clean, structured, and almost clinical. But the technology didn't seem to resemble anything he'd ever seen. There were no buttons, no wires. It was as if the entire ship responded to their thoughts. Over time, they began telling him who they were and where they came from. They said they were from a planet called Larga, a world that was outside of our solar system. And according to Stefan, they didn't come to Earth by accident, they were just observing. They were studying humanity, not to start some war or not for colonization, they were just watching. He claimed they told him about their society and how it worked, and how it was different. They lived under a strict but efficient social structure. There was no private ownership, no profit-driven systems, and everything was centered on planetary stability and the well-being of their population as a whole. Decisions were made for the good of the future, not the individual. They saw Earth as chaotic and wasteful, a world with potential, but one that hadn't figured out how to protect itself from its own systems, and eventually, they returned him to his boat. His family now had no recollection of what happened. The engine started back up and there were no signs anything out of the ordinary had occurred, except for Stefan's memory. He didn't go public right away, in fact, he stayed quiet for a couple years. He wrestled with whether or not to speak at all, but in 1969, he published his first book under this pseudonym, Stefan Denaerde. It was called Operation Survival Earth. He would also publish another book in 1982, and the book was called UFO Contact from Planet Larga. But here's the thing, I obviously want to doubt this myself, you guys know how I am, but it wasn't written like a sci-fi story. It was structured, dense, and full of philosophical descriptions of Largan society, how they approached energy, economics, and even education. There's diagrams and systems. It reads more like a briefing than a narrative, which this part to me is just really cool. It veers away from a lot of the clearly exaggerated stuff. It does feel like something out of the Orville though. And again, he did do the whole book publishing thing, but we'll get to some details in a minute that kind of makes that seem like it wasn't for profit. And he didn't launch a lecture circuit or sell merchandise. In fact, he all but disappeared after these were published. He never pushed the story beyond what was already in those pages, and in this one obscure interview from 1969 that discusses his encounters over the years. But there's some cool stuff in these books, like in the one he published in 1969, he was explaining a flat square screen on which you could conjure up information on. And there's more details, but when you read it, it just clearly seems like he's describing tablets. This was way before the internet, this was 1969. He talks about this in the 7th edition on page 97. I'm personally still on the fence. I mean, it's sort of like most other encounters. You have the book, the ominous guy behind the story, the ship abducting them, the other planet, but this was pretty early on, and upon doing some research, it seems the businessman behind Stefan Denaerde, his real identity, was a Dutch car importer named ACM Beers, or at Beers, who in 1990 was reportedly one of the richest Dutch people, at a net worth of 190 million. And the fact that he was already so rich kind of just negates the whole making up a story for profit thing. But on that same note, if the aliens were telling him that capitalism was bad and all that, well, this guy clearly profited off of capitalism in all the years after that, so how much does he believe it? And on top of this, there's just so many holes in dates and research here, and of course there's a language barrier, so a lot of this that I'm telling you, take it with a grain of salt. The interview is just extremely cool too, I'll link it in the description. It's just cool that Stefan never described his encounter as something violent or terrifying. He didn't say they warned of global catastrophe or demanded anything, and he didn't say that they did experiments on him. He said they wanted him to understand a different way of living, a different kind of society. And whether it happened exactly as he described or if it happened at all, we don't know, but if it didn't, the level of thought and structure in his story does make it stand out. This is a short entry that didn't really have that serious of consequences, but it's just peculiar and very odd, and it's exactly the type of thing that I love covering in these videos, so I'm gonna cover it. On the morning of August 6 in 2019, two men boarded a public bus in the city of Lincoln, England. Their destination was Skegness, a popular seaside town known for its beaches, arcades, and family-friendly vibe. It was a normal route, and nothing about it seemed remarkable. It's just another bus ride through the East Midlands countryside. The two men, who have not been publicly named by police, weren't sitting alone for long. At some point during the journey, they were joined by an elderly woman. She was described as being very well presented and polite. There was no indication that she was under distress or behaving erratically. In fact, the three had some very pleasant conversations. They burned time as the bus ride went by, and nothing memorable really happened. It was just small talk among strangers on public transport. Eventually, the woman got off the bus at a stop about halfway through their route, and before she stepped off, she kindly shook both of the men's hands. And that was it, or at least it seemed like that was it. A few minutes later, the men noticed something strange. There were puncture wounds on their hands. Not scratches or cuts, but like actual puncture wounds. They almost looked surgical in appearance. They weren't the kind of thing that would immediately scream serious emergency, but it was definitely enough to raise eyebrows. The timing, the immediate appearance of the wounds following that handshake was impossible to ignore. So, the two men made their way to a local hospital where doctors examined the wounds. According to police reports, the injuries were not serious, but they were definitely unusual, and the questions around them only grew. Why did both of these men have nearly identical puncture wounds, and why did they appear right after the contact with this elderly woman? Lincolnshire police were brought in and quickly realized that this wasn't a routine call, and so they started reviewing CCTV footage from the bus and identified 4 individuals who had also been riding that day. Believing that they may have witnessed something important, police released stills of those passengers to the public, urging them to come forward, and crucially, officers emphasized that none of these people were suspects. They were simply witnesses, passengers who may have seen, heard, or noticed something that was out of place. And as for the woman at the center of it all, she's never been identified.